There's food out here if anybody wants some.
We have a water cooler just around the corner too.
Do you mind? I just have to get that water.
My theory is that it's similar to be more likely to identify.
How they all have majors and.
Yeah.
So.
There's still a core, a core curriculum, but they've all got their different majors.
Which institution is this?
West Point. I teach at West Point, the
Okay.
military academy. I teach there, so he was asking me about how the curriculum's changed.
We'll spend a few minutes after 12, let people get in, so we'll have grab me food out there. We'll be there after 2.
So this is primarily the.
A lot of it. But yeah, it's 45 cents. I feel fine though.
Yeah.
Right. So depending on the aspect, it's a good question.
That's one that I usually have at a conference, right?
Andrew Jackson. You're out there about
One way or the other.
One way or the
Probably not.
Worth it?
This will take.
Where is that?
Yeah, it's a initial.
Oh, that's nice.
Very easy for you.
I know you guys had.
Numerous.
Yeah.
It's a great space.
Yeah, it is. Hey, how are you?
Sign people in.
I got a ticket.
That works.
Yours.
Okay.
I just got an invitation to this. Is this an organization that people can join?
So this is right now we're kind of working. One is the school, and then this is what
Yeah, and they, it's the same thing.
Good. You need, I can take your last name.
It's okay.
Yeah, we come to a lot of events and it sounds like you're on the list and we'll get you up all the time.
Okay, well, no, that's great. That's what I wanted to know.
All right, sure, you're good.
So,
Okay, try to
after you attend an event, update you on all the next events, so try to get on the radar and if you're welcome to then.
Outstanding. Thank you very much.
Did your wife come with you as well? No, she did. And I asked her very tight. You can register? I did, she registered. About it. And one of the people signed a charity with us. And it might be out of the winter.
That clock a little bit fast. It's a big way.
In that direction, sir. Okay, we're Lennox over there, all the way down to the wall to the left.
Well, they are, next week are final thing, so I asked them next week.
And there was a
Really?
breakdown of.
Next time, May 20th.
Social unrest and riots or
So yeah, so this
minorities being restricted.
hunkering down here the last few days.
Makes you think about what
No summer.
Yeah, one starts May 15th, and the other starts July 10th. So, but usually we keep this space open during the day. Next door,
is everyone?
well, you know, your Jackson, you know, it's.
You are there, look back.
Yeah.
Well, you think you did.
We have another thing
Yeah.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, that's, yeah, no, this for this one. Yes. No.
All the time. Yeah.
I looked at this.
I was, whoops.
Yeah. Always in.
I could imagine having it, so.
Along the bells.
Everyone,
but to those who are thinking about and working on current affairs. And we chose this subject for today's event because of what you've probably seen at the surge in interest in Andrew Jackson. As you probably know, he is one of, if not the favorite president of our new president, Donald Trump. He was also the subject of some controversy not too long ago when it was decided to replace him with a $20 bill with Harriet Tubman. And he's certainly someone who I think remains a contested character. A lot of people don't necessarily view him as one of their favorites, but he does have a large following. And in terms of foreign policy, which is the primary focus, he's seen as the founder of one of the principal strains of American foreign policy, the Jacksonian tradition, which is nationalist and focusing on dealing with mortal threats when quite decisively, but not necessarily being as active abroad. But so once we decided we were interested in Andrew Jackson, I started looking to see who was writing on this subject in a compelling fashion. And fortunately, we found our speaker, who happens to have written several books and also has a recent essay that he's written on civil military relations that he's going to talk about today. And civil military relations is also a subject that we think is quite important today. And we've had Dr. Owens actually speak on that subject at another event a few months ago for us. So we are delighted to bring you one of the nation's leading historians on Andrew Jackson. I'll give you a brief background on him and then turn it over to him. So Dr. Samuel Watson, he's Samuel Watson IV. His father, the third, is also able to join us, which is great. But Samuel Watson is a professor of history at the United States Military Academy, where he directs theses on the United States since 1877 and teaches full range of U.S. and military history, including Cold War America, warfare in the age of industrialization, and the making of modern America. And his research focuses on the U.S. Army between the Revolution and the War with Mexico. He's co-editor of the electronic textbook, The West Point History of Warfare, which won the 2016 Society for Military History George C. Marshall Foundation Prize for the use of digital technology teaching military history. He's also the co-editor of the West Point History of the Civil War, which won the 2014 Army Historical Foundation Distinguished Writing Award, and also the forthcoming West Point History of the American Revolution. Perhaps his most well-known and distinguished award was in 2014 when he won the Society for Military History Distinguished Book Award, which for those who may not be familiar with the society, it's the premier body for the study of military history, and the Distinguished Book Awards are highly sought after and prize that only a few people have the good fortune to receive. So he actually received it for 2 volumes that go together. One is Jackson's Sword, the Army Officer Corps on the American Frontier, 1810 to 1821, and Peacekeepers and Conquerors, the Army Officer Corps on the American Frontier, 1821 to 1846, both published by the University Press of Kansas. So I'll turn it over to Dr. Watson. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Mark, and thank you all for coming out here on such a wonderful day. And thank you to both of our institutions here, Mark's Center for Military and Diplomatic History and the Institute for Politics, for putting this together and helping me with my transportation and getting me down to speak to you all. Well, first I should say that the views I express are not those of the United States Military Academy, the Department of the Army, the Department of Defense, or any other government agency. And as you'll see, it's good to be forewarned, I am not a fan of Andrew Jackson, at least in terms of civil military relations and many of his policies. He was a very effective general and a very effective president, but not a very well restrained or balanced one. Mark was referring to some of the books and whatnot, so I should give this a plug because this is the origin of the talk I'm giving today. Down in Florida, they're coming up on Jackson's 200th anniversary of his invasion of Spanish Florida in 1818, what became called the First Seminole War, and then his governorship of Florida as the first territorial governor in 1821. So the various Florida historians put together a book, Andrew Jackson in Florida, from the Florida Historical Society, and they invited me to write about Jackson, territorial expansion, and civil military relations. And then my research, this is the first of the 2 volumes that Mark referred to. My research began with the United States Army and its Officer Corps. And I was talking to one of the IWP faculty that I started out studying military professionalism. But so often military professionalism is seen as being a matter of expertise and capability in usually conventional military operations, war fighting, against large state-sponsored armies. And I realized that in the period that I was studying, the Army's mission was usually to intimidate. It was to intimidate the Indians, to try to force them to move west. It was to persuade, or if necessary, intimidate whites to prevent them from attacking the Indians and getting the United States into wars. That would be expensive in blood and treasure. It was to deter the British or to intimidate the Spanish, as Jackson did very effectively in winning Florida. But rarely was it to actually fight major wars, conventional wars. Officers at that time, the early 1800s, they often thought in terms of fighting the British, right? The British were sort of like the premier enemy, and if we could defeat the British, if you could do that as an officer, as a general, your reputation would be made. But in fact, most of what they did most of the time was some version of persuasion or coercion or intimidation. So it's almost sort of diplomacy, diplomacy backed by force. Yeah, rather than the sort of professional institutions or training or practice for combat that many historians and professionals have studied. So in effect, I became as much a historian of civil military relations, mostly from the military side, as one of military professionalism. And in this period I'm studying, most of what the Army is doing is on the frontiers, or what we sometimes call the borderlands, and Jackson in particular, right, in the South, and on the frontier between the United States and Spanish Florida. So I'm going to talk about Jackson as both a general and as a president. But we should start out, I'm a historian now, I'm going to be looking at a fairly, I suppose, narrow slice of our history in chronology. But I think we should start out by specifying some criteria, some terms. So what do we, citizens of the United States, from civil military relations? And there are 2 sides to this, right? We want military subordination to civilian direction, and we want civilian support for military efforts to secure the objectives that are set by civilian leaders. Right? So civil military relations is kind of like a balance beam, right? They're competing, I don't know if you want to say imperatives, but they're competing drives there, competing demands. But it is a balance beam in which the military ultimately serves society, as society is represented by civilian leaders. So what do effective civil military relations require? And so again, effective would mean both subordinate, the military isn't out of control, it's a civilian government, representative government, but also an effective military conducting an effective or supporting or executing an effective foreign policy. So the first thing that you probably want is first thing we think we would want is some experience, that each side has some experience of the other side's perspective and the other side's problems and the other side's concern. And Jackson had some of that because he had been a prominent politician before he became a general in the War of 1812. So in a sense, he was ideally positioned to bring the two sides of civil military relations together effectively. But on the other hand, and this is where Jackson faces so much criticism, effective civil military relations, any situation where you need a balance, requires a balanced temperament. And Jackson was a man of great passion, great emotion, great determination, and often great willfulness and disregard for the opinions of others, including his constitutional superiors. Again, Jackson had a great deal of experience, or potential experience, to be able to understand both perspectives in civil military relations, but his willfulness, and you can take this really as the thesis of my talk, his willfulness, his determination, his sense of self-righteousness meant that he often interacted with civilian leaders when he was a general, or later with military leaders when he was president, in tones of military command rather than civilian political compromise or coalition building. And that worked when he was president. He could tell the generals what to do, right? But when he was a general, that created a lot of issues. Now, Jackson did reshape American civil military relations, which had been kind of inchoate and not very firmly developed before him. And this was especially true during his tenure as commander of the Southern Division of the National Standing Army, the regular army. One of the Army's top two positions from the War of 1812 until his retirement from the Army to become governor of Florida in 1821. Most Americans probably think of Jackson as a citizen soldier and a leader of volunteers. I think that's from New Orleans, right? That's sort of the Jackson myth, or one of the Jackson myths. But in fact, Jackson valued the regular army. He led its soldiers. He had a regular commission. He started out as a militia general, from Tennessee, but was then commissioned directly into the regular army as a general. And so he led regular soldiers as well as volunteers and militiamen to victories over Britain, Spain, and various Native American societies in the South during this period. So what was Jackson's track record in civil military relations? First as a general officer, commanding the main American land force in the South. Well, he repeatedly, 3 times, in 1814, 1816, and 1818, went beyond and indeed counter to policy instructions from the President of the War Department by attacking Spanish forces in Pensacola, in West Florida, in 1814 and 1818. And then by authorizing an incursion by subordinates into Spanish Florida in 1816. This is back when Congress did actually declare war, right? So no declarations of war, and in each of these cases, he had received instructions from the War Department and even from the President, do not attack the Spanish Florida, the main war being Pensacola. Within the United States during this period, Jackson declared martial law in New Orleans in 1815. And he detained a federal judge, he detained other prominent local citizens, and he ordered the evacuation of people of French and Spanish origin from the coast to the interior. It's not clear to what extent the evacuation was carried out, but he in each of these cases, he asserted a sweeping authority as the military theater commander, believing that he was responsible and for national security there, and that he was operating under what he called the natural law of self-defense. Now, in doing this, he was asserting himself as the tribune of American national security policy, American diplomacy, American foreign relations, etc. So whatever we think of that natural law of self-defense as a principle, perhaps a not unreasonable one, he was usurping congressional and civilian executive authority. U.S. policy laid out by the President and the Secretary of War was not to attack the Spanish. And even if we could reconcile Jackson's doing so with the congressional authority to declare war, rather the United States sought to avoid war with Spain, in particular after the War of 1812, right? So in the 1816 to 1818 incidents, the United States, the President, the War Department was concerned that attacking Spain would give the British a pretext to essentially resume the war. It's really not until about 1818 or so that the United States, that its leaders feel comfortable that the War of 1812 isn't going to start up again over some incident, that they feel that the British are sort of waiting to attack us again. Until John Quincy Adams helps to negotiate peace with the British. In Louisiana, U.S. policy, so thinking that martial law in New Orleans in 1815, in Louisiana, U.S. policy since the Louisiana Purchase a decade before had been to gain the support of the Francophone majority through conciliation so that they would voluntarily give their allegiance to the United States. More and more Anglophone Americans, original Americans, I guess, native-born Americans were moving into Louisiana, so it was becoming an Anglo majority. But up to maybe about 1820, the majority of the white citizens of Louisiana were French speakers. And so arresting them or forcing them to move away from the coast and displaying a distrust for them when, after all, it was the British who were attacking Louisiana, seems very miscalculated move on Jackson's part. Now, Jackson did build an effective coalition, and we famously tell the story of he gets Jean and Pierre Lafitte, and he gets a whole there's a battalion of African American militia. There's a whole range of people who help him and groups who help him to defend Louisiana. So there are times when Jackson displays a remarkable diplomacy or diplomatic ability. But it's often a question of 2 steps forward and 1 step back. Now, Jackson did have some reason to believe that Secretary of War and later President James Monroe would not be unhappy if Spain, the Indians in Florida, and various refugees from American slavery in Florida were intimidated and the British were prevented from using Pensacola as a base, or the British were prevented from allying with the Indians in Florida or the refugees from slavery there. So Jackson and Monroe were probably not that far apart in what they hoped to achieve in their ultimate objectives, but had very different ways of trying to get there. Monroe, on the whole, is pretty cautious. Now, on the other hand, 6 months after the forces under Jackson's command had invaded Florida for a second time in 1816, again, contrary to repeated War Department instructions, President Monroe, the incoming President Monroe, this is December 1816, so been inaugurated yet, but offered Jackson a cabinet post as Secretary of War. Jackson declined, but the offer signaled that Monroe recognized Jackson's popularity coming from the Battle of New Orleans, and that he probably shared the Tennesseans' expansionism. So Monroe bears some blame here. I'm not wearing a James Monroe tie either, because Monroe is maybe giving mixed signals, or Monroe he'll give one side he'll give one set of signals that he should, but not the other. Right? He doesn't give the caveats. He doesn't reinforce his restraints on Jackson. Jackson was certain that he had popular support. Right? He sees himself as representing particularly the South and the West and the frontier. And so he pressed ahead of Monroe, to say nothing of Monroe's secretaries of war, William H. Crawford, and then John C. Calhoun after. Monroe was a cautious expansionist who was driven to self-restraint by the defeats inflicted on American forces throughout most of the War of 1812. Like most civilian policymakers and men of affairs in general, Monroe worried about a resumption of war with Britain. Jackson, in contrast, had only faced the British in a single campaign, crushing their offensive against New Orleans. So Jackson, he's never been defeated, and he's never really, I guess, seen the British at their best. So while most Army officers, most of Jackson's subordinates, respected British prowess due to their experience mostly on the Canadian frontier, Jackson scorned the British almost as much as he despised the Spanish, and that means that he's not really worried about the British intervening in a conflict over Florida. Confident in his military prowess, certain that he represented the zeal of Southern and Western whites for expansion at Spanish and Indian expense, Jackson moved against various Indian nations, the Red Stick Creeks, his own former Choctaw and Cherokee allies, and the Seminoles, with little regard for the niceties of diplomacy or for the constitutional separation of powers. Right? So really a lot of this story is a question of the rule of law. Jackson's disrespect for civilian authority demonstrated in those invasions and the martial law was symptomatic of his disrespect, indeed, for constitutionalism and the rule of law when it got in his way. His military insubordination prefigured his disparagement of John Marshall, the Supreme Court, and congressional Whigs, much as the unequal treaties he forced on the Creek, Cherokee, Choctaw, and Chickasaw in the 18 teens presaged those that his agents forced on the same societies, contrary to the language of the Indian Removal Act during the 1830s. The Indian Removal Act passed in 1830, passed by a very, very narrow majority, promised that the Indians would be persuaded to emigrate voluntarily. Right? They wouldn't be driven west at the point of the bayonet or forced into transit camps by military force. Now, unfortunately, the story of Jackson's usurpations doesn't end here. Between his second and third incursions into the territory of a neutral power, Spain, Old Hickory twice demonstrated his sense that military authority could trump civilian authority, or at any rate, his authority could trump other people's authority. Right? It's not clear that he really thought of this in terms of similar military terms. I should caveat that. I think he thinks of it more in terms of, I know it's right, I'm going to do it. But he believed this even in matters of routine process, where he and his elected superiors agreed on questions of substance. Throughout 1816 and 1817, Jackson carried on a long controversy disputing the Secretary of War's power to correspond directly with officers under the general's command. Jackson claimed that doing so would destroy military discipline. While Jackson was the War Department, direct correspondence with junior officers could prove confusing and disruptive. His shrill tone that implicitly denied any civilian jurisdiction or oversight would shock any officer today, and would suffice to make the general a case study in insubordination if his other transgressions were not so much more egregious. Though successive secretaries of war, Crawford, Calhoun, firmly maintained their authority to seek reports and issue orders outside the military chain of command. And that might seem strange to us, but this is, the communications are very slow back then. So when time was critical or ordinary communications seemed disrupted, they would do that. But Jackson was not sanctioned in any way. Indeed, when he was assigned to command the operations against Indians along the Florida border at the end of 1817, that then becomes his invasion, his third invasion of Spanish Florida, he bypassed the civilian authorities to raise volunteers from Tennessee under his own imprimatur, contrary to the established constitutional principle of legislative control over raising armies. And Congress investigated that, but if you wanted to raise volunteers, the president had to raise them. The general could not just raise volunteers, right? Because that would, in their fear of standing armies in the early republic, that would be like Roman generals raising volunteers and ultimately overthrowing the Roman Republic. So raising military force would have to be done through some civilian authority, whether that's federal or whether it's by a state governor. Two other incidents during the 1818 invasion of Florida are equally revealing. First, Jackson threatened to refuse quarter, to refuse the possibility of surrender, to refuse the possibility of quarter to the Spanish garrison in Pensacola, and in fact to kill the Spanish governor unless they surrendered before he began his assault. Now in Europe, who knows what happens to soldiers. Really blunt in saying, I'm going to kill, or I'm going to have the Spanish governor killed, right? As opposed to my soldiers will get out of control and they probably won't accept some of your soldiers surrendering. But this was phrased as, I'm going to kill your entire garrison, unless they surrender right now. And maybe if they surrender a little too late, then I'll kill them, or at least I'll reserve the right to kill them. The personal extremity of that kind of violence threatened to make Jackson's aggression less reconcilable through diplomacy, right? We could say, here's Jackson, he's the male fist, right? And then John Quincy Adams will come in, make the Spanish feel better. But Jackson's threatening that possibility because although Spain could accept another American siege of its outpost in Florida that Jackson had done in 1814, had done 4 years before, and especially if the U.S. promised that it would evacuate the territory, which they commonly did, right? The U.S. would invade, and then the U.S. would say, okay, you guys got to take care of the Indians, don't let the Indians attack us, and the U.S. would pull back. But if Jackson had actually, murdered the king's representative, the Spanish king's representative, and massacred his soldiers, that might have been harder to brook. That would be pretty clearly an act of war, much harder to smooth over. Also, during the 1818 campaign, Jackson hinted I guess we're past hinting, at disdain for civilian authority in a strident reaction to the murder of Allied Indians, some Creek Indians, by Georgia militia at the village of Chehalis, referred to as the Chehaw Massacre. So the Georgians were in the wrong, but Jackson immediately asserted his military authority. Again, is it his authority? Is it military authority? How did he see that? But he immediately asserted that he had the authority over the killers to try them in military courts. And he wrote to the governor of Georgia as if governor of Georgia were one of Jackson's military subordinates. Jackson also proved contemptuous of legal authority in the civilian realm. First, I mentioned martial law in New Orleans, but once he's invaded Florida for what turns out to be the final time in 1818, he usurped both U.S. and Spanish authority by essentially declaring martial law there. After he seized the Spanish outpost at St. Mark's, which is south of Tallahassee on the Gulf Coast, contrary to the explicit instructions that had already been sent to him and to his subordinates, he executed 2 British citizens and 2 Native American leaders as unlawful combatants, but without approval from or even consultation with the president. In both 1815 in New Orleans and in 1818 in Florida, he disregarded the decisions of the military courts he himself convened. So those courts said, don't arrest Louis Louallier, who was one of the French citizens in 1815. The court said, don't execute these 2 British citizens who probably had been aiding the Seminole Indians organizing against the U.S. But Jackson overrode his subordinates' decisions in those courts and went ahead and hung the 2 Britons and the 2 Indians. The Indians he didn't give any sort of trial to. So when called to account by congressional committees for usurping legislative authority, Jackson went his sort of final step, the final example of his egregious behavior by threatening to cut the ears off a Pennsylvania senator, Admiral Laycock, who was criticizing him. So Jackson had proven willful, perhaps to the point of almost an instability in this really lawless violence, right? Contrary to Constitution, contrary to executive direction, contrary to international norms. They didn't really have international law back then, but you could say international custom. But the executive and Congress reacted only with mild rebukes, and this did not dissuade Jackson from this willful lawless path. Though he was fined for some of his actions at New Orleans in 1815, His supporters in Congress got that fine rescinded in the 1840s. And of course, he went on to invade Spanish Florida twice more. He rejected even President Monroe's questions about his aggression in 1818. Monroe sent him a set of questions. Hey, what are you doing? Don't you think maybe we need to figure out a way to explain this? And Jackson said, no, doesn't really need any explanation. I was the military commander. I was defending the United States. They were the enemy. I got the job done. Do you have any questions? And Monroe backed away. And Secretary of State John Quincy Adams, who I'm wearing on my tie, who later opposed Jackson, right? We think of him as sort of Jackson's enemy from the presidential contest. But Adams supported Jackson very strongly, and Adams said to Monroe, "Hey, look, he got the job done. We don't really need a big discussion about this. Let's just push it forward. The Spanish will give in. We'll get Florida." Congress conducted investigations, but the House voted down resolutions condemning Jackson, while the Senate tabled a critical report made by its committee, whose chairman Jackson had threatened with mutilation, and whose chairman, that Pennsylvania senator, promptly joined in the unanimous vote ratifying the treaty in which Spain ceded Florida to the United States. So in the end, Congress, including Jackson's most ardent critics, accepted the product of Jackson's actions, the cession of Florida to the United States. Let me turn and finish up by talking about Jackson's civil military relations with Jackson as president. So at this point during the 1830s, if one knows about these things, one is probably used to thinking that the Jacksonians didn't like the regular army, they didn't like West Point, they preferred volunteer and citizen soldiers. And that was true of a lot of the Jacksonians, his followers, but not the case in practice. The Jacksonians could have replaced West Point. They could have opened up commissions to a variety of other sources, to militiamen, to volunteers, to frontiersmen, what have you. But they pretty consistently and almost entirely maintained the policy of the military academy monopoly on new officer commissions. And they gradually expanded the regular army by about a third between 1833 and the War of Mexico to execute Indian revolt and Jackson's other expansion responses. So Jackson, in effect, relied on the regular army that many of his followers criticized to achieve his objectives. Now, this produced some friction with now Jackson as the president between Jackson and his military sequence. A number of senior army officers, senior army leaders, had privately supported Jackson for president in 1828. They thought he would be the president because of his aggressiveness and that he would defend American national security, he would advance American interests. But between 1821, the cession of Florida, and Jackson's election, there had been, that's only 7 years, but there had been a period of sort of strategic pause for the United States. There hadn't been any pressing national security threats. And the Army had sort of, I guess we could say, had focused inward a bit, developing its professional institutions, and had, for reasons that are still need some explanation, had become much less belligerent toward Indians in general. Maybe you could say that they felt that the Indian threat had largely been defeated, and it wasn't such a, didn't require such extreme measures. So when Jackson moves forward with the policy of Indian removal, a lot of Army officers were hesitant, reluctant, skeptical of those policies, and particularly felt that those policies violated treaties, which are part of the Constitution, right? Violated some previous American laws for relations with the Indians. And many officers felt that the United States was being unnecessarily aggressive toward the Indians. And many of these officers didn't have a lot of sympathy for the southern and the western frontiers. So this is a matter of class and culture as much as anything else. In executing Indian removal, as president, Jackson micromanaged his generals, executing far closer and more capricious supervision than Madison or Monroe had exerted over him. And so again, is this a question of civil military relations, or is this a question of Jackson? Right? You could dismiss a lot of this by saying, well, it's Jackson, and he's the exception rather than the rule. But as a result, many senior military commanders actually became anti-Jacksonians and Whigs, again, privately, with the exception of Winfield Scott staying out of politics. Military relations is that Jackson aside, the Army's commanders persevered and they executed his policies they were skeptical of, policies that many of them doubted the morality of. But the Army juggled the sometimes contradictory requirements of treaties and law, trying to moderate their impact while remaining subordinate to the constitutional authorities of the President and Congress. So in the 18-teens, we've got a military, or at least a senior military commander who's very insubordinate, usurping a lot of civilian authority, and yet the President and Congress aren't sanctioning him. He gets elected as president, right, which would appear to validate his lawless and unconstitutional actions, right, that the ends had in effect justified the means for the majority of the voters. And in the 1830s, he goes on to push a pretty aggressive policy toward Native Americans. And in the 1830s, as in the 18-teens, the Army largely supports him. But now, instead of supporting him because they are aggressive, they want to push out the British, push out the Spanish, or they, in the 18-teens, hated the Indians. Now they're supporting him really much more out of constitutional principle. Right? They're saying, in effect, look back, are we going to act the way Jackson acted 20 years ago to subordinate ourselves to his policies, even if we disagree with them? Right? And that for the military is sort of the essence of responsible civil military relations, is that you're going to execute policies even if you individually or some group of officers around you disagree with them. A difficult putting them in very difficult positions, demanding that they succeed without getting him in any trouble or making the administration look bad. On the whole, what we get coming out of the 1830s is a much more balanced civil military relations. It is a much clearer military subordination to civilian authority, and at the same time, a reliance by the executive branch, by Congress, by the federal government on the military to execute some of its more controversial policies. So that you get a sort of synergy here, and that synergy, I think, was both much more lawful and much more effective than the civil military relations when Jackson himself had been a general. So let me stop there, and I'll be happy to take questions.
Yes. How does what you've been saying play out during the nullification crisis? In other words, were there Southern generals who were reluctant but said, the president is actually what? They were threatening the force bill. They were thinking they were going to raise an army and march in. Was there discontent among the officer corps about that? Was there debate about that?
There's not any discontent evident in. I've gone through, I think, probably about as many documents are available. There was concern. The War Department did have the Army, did have certain officers certify their loyalty to the United States, in effect to sort of retake the oath. So they did have some suspicion about the loyalties of some officers here, mostly South Carolinians, since it was focused there. But Jackson was very anti-nullification and sent down one of his, I guess we'd say, military enemies, Winfield Scott. He and Scott had actually, I think Scott challenged Jackson to a duel, and Jackson decided not to. But back in the 18 teens, with all the mess that Jackson was in then. But Jackson sent Scott, and Scott turns out to be a very bold sort of military diplomat. He gets on very well with the South Carolinians on both sides, right? And is able to, both show force, and show the flag and also kind of smooth things over. So that's a good example where Jackson, I think if Jackson had been there, Jackson would not be a good, diplomat in Charleston during the nullification winter. But Jackson did have the ability to identify talent and to, send the right talent to the right place.
Given,
Go ahead. Yeah.
given Jackson's actions in the 18 teens and early 1820s, how much of that can you attribute to, or how much of the inaction by Washington to that would you attribute to, number one, poor, slow communications? Jackson did something, we don't know about it in Washington until a month later, and just lack of institutions in the Congress to deal with it.
I'd say more the former than the latter. Congress did have its various committees, and it created, investigatory committees or subcommittees. The communications were a big factor, and I think Jackson definitely drew on that, as he thought, or if to the extent he thought, why am I doing this? I think Jackson saw it as, I'm here, they're in Washington, time is of the essence, I have to act. On the other hand, when it came to the invasions of Florida, Jackson had received, written orders that said, don't attack Pensacola, right? Don't attack Spanish Coast. So Jackson, I would say Jackson had, I would say that applied up to a point, but that Jackson pretty consistently went past that point in seizing the authority to take, really decisions of war and peace. The good thing is the Spanish were very weak. They didn't really have the capacity to resist. And the British, for a variety of reasons, they were not going to resume the War of 1812. So in effect, and one could argue that Jackson saw those things, right? And that Jackson had a better understanding of the international situation than Monroe and the War Department. So again, one can say that Jackson is often very effective, but he has virtually no regard for process.
I think John Quincy Adams even said the reason he was so successful in buying Florida so cheap was because of Jackson's intimidation.
Yeah, so I think that's certainly the case. Oh wait, let me get it.
Well, my question is related but more open-ended. So why did Jackson get away with it? So we understand the slowness of communications, but what were the other chief factors?
I think principally because he had become so popular since the Battle of New Orleans, and particularly in the South and the West. So you do have some critics in the Northeast, but the Federalist Party is no longer very strong, so there's not really a party base for criticism. And I think that the vast majority of American, of white American citizens and American leaders did want to get the British and the Spanish and the Indians and refugees from slavery, get them out of Florida, secure Florida. So I think certainly his objectives were very much in line with those of most Americans. The real question in all of this is, does the end justify the means, or to what extent does the end justify the means, or is maybe this is okay because then Jackson became president, right? And so and then there's really nobody like Jackson coming around for a long, perhaps until MacArthur, but I don't think you would want the majority of your generals to act in Jackson's manner.
Right. Two different question areas. One is, I wonder if during that period of time, and I've never studied anything about Jackson's military activities, but might have there been a different political military understanding where, and I would use as an example, when the Fourth Crusade from Rome had instructions explicitly from papacy not to sack Constantinople, and they sacked Constantinople. So in a way, the orders to Jackson sort of give cover to, the politicians, and then they weren't really all that disappointed with the result. They're actually maybe pleased with the result. But my real question, having studied his activities more as president in a monetary context, he of course ended the Second Bank of the U.S. and arguably the most constitutional president we've ever had concerning the monetary provisions of the Constitution. And the question is, do you think he was aware? Some say that the reason we were given the War of 1812 by the British is because we had failed to renew the charter of the First Bank of the U.S. And there's been this recurring theme in history that we must have a central bank controlled by European interests, as we do now. And Jackson spoke prophetically in his farewell address of 1837, warning against ever letting there be another central bank, where he said corporatism and politicians and the financiers would inflate credit until the average person lost their wealth and control over the country. So was Jackson aware of the monetary issue in a military context?
I don't think he was during the period that I really talked about here. I think he becomes conscious of monetary issues really from the Depression from 1819, the Panic of 1819. And that sense of the disparities or bottlenecks in monetary flows, that's going to influence him, then a decade later. But I think during the 18 teens, most of the time when he's a general, he's focused, he's reacting to threats or what he sees as threats.
Time for one more question.
Just get back to that original point. It's almost like he's a loaded weapon. I mean, they know about Jackson's history. They know about his history, and yet they're sending him down with the orders. In what universe did they think that this was not going to happen?
That is an excellent question. My conclusion in my book is that one can't say, because if nothing else, people don't put these things on paper, but that it was certainly irresponsible for Monroe to believe that Jackson would stick to his orders. Yeah. So that's a good blunt way to conclude on. Yeah. So again, do the ends justify the means?
There's just things that we're talking about, is civil military relations and everything, but this is also a time when you have poor communications and stuff. I mean, I'm just curious, Jackson, was it just the victories that he wanted, or did he have all his own ideas for territorial expansion that he was using his generalship to go after?
Well, I think he shared the expansionism of most Americans, and certainly most Americans in the South and the West, and certainly most Americans who lived on or near the frontiers. So your question then might be, should he think of himself as their representative, or should he think of himself as a United States Army officer who is serving under the elected representatives of the United States as a whole, and that there might be people, let's say, particularly in the Northeast, who maybe they share the expansionism, but they're worried about the British, or they don't think we should be so, like they feel it's dishonorable to continue to really attack the Indians, without clear provocation. And that's another thing I see in my books, is that the officer corps that in, let's say, 1815 did have you could call it a sectional tinge. The guys in the South, many of them saw themselves as Southerners, and then guys in the North, they thought in terms of the Canadian border, right? Where we obviously weren't about to,
We did it once.
we tried it once, but we failed, right? So But by the 1830s, partly because they've had that pause in the 1820s, and I think partly because they've thought a little bit about, whether they all want to be Jacksons, or whether they all can be Jacksons, or whether it would be better to, sort of follow the Constitution. And partly because more and more, the junior officers, they're all coming out at West Point, and they're being sort of socialized. The idea is you're coming together, and the guy from South Carolina and the guy from Pennsylvania, will be together, and they're being told they're U.S. Army officers. And so the commissioning and then the socialization of the officer corps is much more national than it had been, let's say,
It
before.
just seems like before that time, they were raised by their own thing, they
Right.
were basically, and so it's a different culture to
Right.
a certain extent. I mean, was there this great respect for civil military relations with other generals, or was Jackson just the man away? Or the poster child for this?
I would say that he is definitely the exception in how pretty consistently disrespectful he is. Now, because he is that one exception, you can say, well, maybe it's not the U.S. Army was undermining civilian authority. You could say Jackson as an individual. It probably wouldn't matter, if Jackson were a civilian politician, he would try to do what he wanted. That's, the Whigs in the 1830s call him King Andrew, because they feel he's very high-handed and he's acting as if he were a general again. Being in the military gives him that force, right? Gives him the command over the soldiers, that he can do these things in a way that a civilian politician generally can't. A civilian politician has to get people together and vote on something. So you can see Jackson's willfulness and his personal aggression a lot more clearly as a general because of that power.
Thank you, Dr. Watson. If you could join me in a round of applause for a great presentation.
Thank you all.
Thanks. There's still some food out here.
I'll share with you, if you haven't read Jackson's farewell address, 1837, what he said in the monitoring about central banking paper money is just even today, it's among the most clear understanding of the problems of what the Constitution called. Actually, I have a domain forwarded to a series of Dropbox folders, edthefed.info.
Okay.
Under the Andrew Jackson head, you'll see where I actually took out a full-page ad in the Washington Times, walking in President Trump with the excerpt about the monetary provisions from Jackson's address. He had Jackson, parentheses 1837, number to Trump, 2017. I think you might, actually, if you have I'll forward it to the PDF. So, where are you based? Teaching West Point. Well, speaking of civil and military relations, control where the gold and silver coin come from.
Yes.
The military, that's under military protection or control.
I don't know. We have a, I don't know what's the only I don't really follow these things.
It's a remarkable thing to read. One of the military officers who was on the tribunal investigating the Edwards assassination. Thomas, I can't remember his name right now. He wrote a book in 1892, responsibility for the assassination. There was actually suppressed memory of incidents of, well, you say the ends justify the means, it's the Jesuit. The fingerprints of the Jesuits on the all were actually the last 500 years of history.
Thank you. Take care.
There's that supposed integration with West Point was bringing about, kind of fell apart.
It did, but
I've looked.
the whole nation fell apart.
Yeah, well, I mean, what gets me is Bobby Lee. I've looked at the oath that existed that he took in 1842, whatever year.
Well, his initial oath would be what, 29?
Yeah, anyway, the oath Doesn't say anything about Virginia.
Yeah, it's, that's true.
I would have hanged him.
Do you think that, historiography, that Adams giving him a penny, that Adams saying it was okay, affected historiography about Jackson? Because, I mean, I was recently just, for different reasons, talking to students, and I read this and I go, man, I mean, given the later history, which of course is easy, so Adams, that hit me. Well, what does that say? Well, they just say that that's what that shows Adams' foreign policy. He had an objective in mind. It's messy. This is the world. We take it. We can't go. I can't go on the world. We should be going on the world stage and censoring somebody next, you know. But it's still really surprising. You know? It's like, I don't know whether that's part of the historiography. So whether keep that time in period. From 1840 on, this was how.
Yeah. Well, in terms of Adams, of course, Adams changes so much.
Right.
Becomes moves from right to
Right.
In terms of Jackson, I would really only say it's the last 20 or 30 years that a lot of historians have been critical of Jackson. Think about that. He's still, he's still very pro-Jackson. Right.
It's really fascinating. Well, I guess the later sensibilities, I just missed it.
Right. Well, I think when he was like,
Correct. Correct. Yeah, that's the whole question.
He was searching for
Where
these.
the Democratic Party come from?
And so Schlesinger's Jackson, here's going to kind of argue he's the white word.
Right.
And so it's like the Harriet Tubman gets into it now. 20 years ago, there were historians who might say that, but in general, why don't these historians like Andrew Jackson, which I think a lot of them still think.
And I think the entire Native American is